Thanks, Mala. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Jonathan Smallwood to give the CIC lecture. So Professor Smallwood completed his BA with honours in psychology and PhD in psychology, both at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. Between 2013 and 2020, he held the position of Professor of Psychology at the University of York in England. And he's just recently moved to Canada last October to take up a new role as a Professor of Psychology at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. So his work is focused on understanding the neural basis behind the thoughts and feelings that occupy our daily lives. And to do this, he uses state-of-the-art techniques for brain analysis, as well as novel methods for assessing patterns of ongoing thought and task-driven behaviour. So we're all very excited to hear Professor Smallwood share some of this work with us today. And also we're hoping that this can be the start of some ongoing collaborations between our institutes now that Professor Smallwood is just down the road from us. So whenever you're ready, Professor Smallwood, over to you. Just to say for all the attendees, Professor Smallwood is open to taking questions throughout the talk, so you can just post them in the chat as usual, or if you want to ask it out loud, you can raise your hand and I'll be monitoring that.
Great, thanks for that introduction. So today what I'm going to do is talk about work that I've been involved in for the last, I don't know, 10 years probably. And it's really been to do with trying to understand the relationship between sort of ongoing thought patterns that people have and brain activity that underlies it. Okay, so that's why my talk is called The Neural Correlates of Ongoing Experience. And just I thought I would start by just explaining that I'm lucky enough to work with a lot of people who do the bulk of the work that I talk about. So I just thought I would start my talk by illustrating people who've played a big role in the things I'm going to talk about today. So there's some students on the left-hand side of the screen who worked with me at York, and external collaborators who've provided a lot of the techniques and expertise that we use. Okay, so when I was a very much younger student and deciding that I wanted to be a scientist, I read a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis by Francis Crick. And it was obviously, I mean, as you probably know, Francis Crick became interested in conscious experience. And one of the points I remember understanding from reading the book was that if you were trying to understand the relationship between sort of brain activity whilst people have different types of experience, then what might sometimes happen is that the activity that you pick up with a brain imaging device would be partly related to unconscious processing and partly related to conscious processing. And in his book, Francis Crick argued that the way that you would solve this problem is to seek correlates of states when experience is changing, but the stimulus that you present to the brain doesn't. So for example, he talked about the concept of binocular rivalry, because under those circumstances, you can present to the brain the same information and subjectively you can switch between different interpretations. And I kind of understood, I guess, at that point that this property of stimulus independence was perhaps one way, therefore, of getting a handle on conscious experiences. And one of the things I began to understand was it might be possible to understand aspects of conscious experience, therefore, by focusing on states like daydreaming and what we now think about as mind wandering, because these are also states where conscious experience seems to be decoupled from the immediate environment. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is really just the research program that grew out of that idea. Okay, so to give you a kind of a roadmap of what my talk's going to do, the first thing I'm going to talk about today is some boundary conditions that I think are important when you're trying to do this mapping between ongoing patterns of experience and brain activity. And then what I'm going to do is talk about one of the techniques that we actually have developed to understand this problem, which we call multi-dimensional experience sampling. And then what I'm going to do is talk about two aspects of experience that this technique has revealed to us. One of them is to do with this, a dimension that seems to relate to whether people are focused externally or generating information in their heads using sort of episodic memory, I guess. And another one which is to do with some kind of detailed focus that experience can have. And then finally, I'm just going to close by thinking about some of the implications that these studies may have for the neural systems that underpin cognition. Okay, so one of the assumptions that we have realized that is important in understanding ongoing experience is that basically it's quite a complex and heterogeneous state. So to illustrate this, you can kind of think about, for example, the same environment can have different people within it, and that they might interpret or understand things happening in that environment differently from each other. So there can be heterogeneity between how different people will appreciate or respond to a situation. But there can also be heterogeneity over time, because as we're probably all aware, our thoughts can move through different states, I guess. And so what this kind of suggests is that when we're thinking about how to model and understand patterns of conscious experience, for example, we need to understand that different people will have different experiences, and that their experiences will also change with time. And another important variable that we think is important when trying to map brain activity to ongoing thought patterns is that the context probably matters quite a lot. So for example, we can all understand that as we go through our daily life, we are in different environments and doing different things. And that as a consequence of that, our experiences are likely to reflect different aspects of the environment and the and so basically the activities we're doing and the context within which they take place are likely also to be important in, in determining what we think about on a momentary basis. So what we do to understand this problem is we do use something called the experience sampling method, which is really quite straightforward. All that really happens is we ask people to describe their experiences. You can do this in a lot of different ways. One way to do it is through open-ended thought reports. This can be quite time-consuming, and so we don't really do that very often. More normally, what we do is we ask people a set of questions, and they just answer them. And we can do this across different situations. So, for example, we can page people with their iPhone or their Android phone, I guess, and ask people to tell us what they're thinking about. But we can also perform laboratory experiments and also imaging studies, and ask people in the scanner or in the lab to describe their thoughts. And that means that we can link the reports that they give to measurements we can take. So we can link them to behavior and also underlying neural function. And that's obviously one of the ways that we can try to map between thought patterns that people have and the underlying neural patterns that support them. The specific way that we have tried to do this is something that we call multi-dimensional experience sampling, or MDES. This is basically just a very straightforward feature of experience sampling, in the sense that all we're really doing is asking people to describe their thoughts. But one of the advances, I guess, that we've made is we don't limit the number of questions to a small number. We often ask quite a lot, sometimes as many as 15 questions. And we do this across different contexts because of the importance that the context can make to thought patterns. And I guess one of the underlying assumptions that we use when we perform these studies is that you can kind of gain traction on the heterogeneity of thought patterns if you take this approach by asking people to describe their thoughts on different questions and then apply some type of decomposition algorithm to them. So for example, we quite often use principal components analysis, but you can use other things too. You don't even need to, we can use canonical correlation analysis and various other things. And the idea really is that when we decompose the data that we collect from multidimensional experience sampling, the dimensions that this reveals are some kind of proximal measurement, proximal estimation of thought patterns. So just to kind of clue you in on what they are and how we represent them, I'm showing you an example of the of a dimension of thought that's produced by the method I just described. We can represent them as word clouds, like I'm showing you on the screen at the moment. And basically, that's quite an efficient way of doing that. So in a word cloud like this, the bigger the font size, the more influential the term is in the dimension. and the ink color that we show describes the polarity. So for example, the pattern I'm showing at the moment has the word task quite big and in blue, and the word future and self in red, and they're also quite big. So that would really refer to a dimension that is varying from basically being focused on a task that the person was performing whilst they gave this report, to the something else that they are thinking about in imagination to do themselves in the future. Okay, so this slide just summarizes applying this approach to data collected across different situations. So I'm showing you the first 4 components that we would get if we apply principal component analysis with varimax rotation to the data that we collect. And you can see basically that there's quite a lot of similarity in the structure that you see across these situations. So there's, we basically find very common patterns. And that's kind of important because it tells us that the approach that we're doing has some capacity to reveal reliable patterns of data. So in my talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on 2 of the patterns that we produce in this way. One of them is to do with having quite detailed experiences, and that's shown in the word cloud on the left. And the other one is the word cloud on the right, which I've already talked about, which is really some dimension that varies from a focus on an external task to some type of social episodic thought. Okay. So just before going into each of these specifically, obviously one of the issues related to the approach that we take is that the measurements we take are basically subjective, and so there's lots of strengths, but also weaknesses with relying too much on subjective data. So what I'm just showing you at the moment is a study that we ran a couple of years ago, where we had a big cohort of people and we mapped the patterns of thought that they have in the lab as they perform a simple task. And we related this to the structure of the brain in terms of the cortical grey matter. And what we actually found was that these 2 components that I'm going to focus my talk on today were associated with the amount of grey matter that people had in the parahippocampus. So I'm showing you where the analysis highlighted in this slide. You can see an area in red where basically there was greater thickness if participants tended to report more detailed experiences as they performed a task, and an area in blue which was thicker for people who tended to be on task and thinner for people who tended to spend more time thinking about social episodic thought. This region is part of what we call the default mode network, but I guess the most important conclusion we should probably take from this at the moment is just that we can kind of gain some confidence that the reports that we're gaining from this method of experience sampling are reasonably reliable, in the sense that across a sample of, say, 160 people, I think, we were able to resolve brain correlates that relate to the subjective report. So that gives us some confidence that these are probably useful information. So the first dimension I'm going to focus on is this one that seems to describe the difference between focusing on the task we're performing versus instead of thinking about something episodic, perhaps in the future and related to ourselves. I'm just showing you the word clouds from each of the 3 environments in which we performed the multidimensional experience sampling. And you can see that they're more or less consistent in the sense that we routinely find this pattern. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point that basically this seems to correspond quite nicely to a definition of what we might refer to as mind wandering, in the sense that this is often thought of capturing a state of off-task future focus. So it's kind of interesting, at least, that you can see a mapping between this data-driven pattern across these different environments and this definition of mind wandering from the literature. So after performing quite a lot of studies where we used brain imaging to map neural function at the same time that people gave reports relating to this, we identified that 2 brain regions seem to be particularly useful or important in this particular dimension of experience. So the more people engage in episodic thought rather than thinking about the task, we see greater activity in this region of medial prefrontal cortex. Whereas when people are instead thinking about the task they're performing, they seem to activate a region of dorsal parietal cortex. And so these are encouraging, again, for the reason that we are able to see the mapping between neural function and also subjective reports. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to understand the broader networks within which these are involved. So what I'm showing you at the moment is just the top panel on the slide shows a very simple seed-based connectivity in which we used either the medial prefrontal or the dorsal parietal cortex as seeds and performed a functional connectivity analysis. And the regions in blue are more closely aligned to the parietal region, and the regions in red are more closely aligned to the medial prefrontal cortex. And what's interesting is I'm showing you that pattern at the same time as showing you the consequence of applying a decomposition algorithm, which is often used to identify things called connectivity gradients, which are basically dimensions within the connectivity matrix you can generate using resting state data. And you can see basically that there's a close mapping between the connectivity patterns at the top and this connectivity gradient at the bottom, which seems to separate basically the default mode from regions of cortex, which are sometimes referred to as multiple demand network, simply because they seem to be important for performing complex external tasks. And so that's kind of interesting at one level because it suggests that there's a correspondence between a subjective dimension that we can identify using multi-dimensional experience sampling, which goes from task focus to episodic thought, that seems to correspond to a pattern inherent in the connectivity matrix, which relates to the difference between external task focus regions and regions of the default mode network. And we also did other things using the same type of approach. One thing we wanted to know was whether or not there was any relationship between specific types of information processing and people's tendency to engage in this type of thought. So in one study, we asked people to come into the scanner, and they basically, we showed them lots of different stimuli, including faces and also places, and we would have scrambled versions of the same stimuli as a control. And what we found was that people who spend a lot of time engaged in thinking in an episodic manner tend to also activate this region of lateral temporal cortex more when processing faces. And that's just interesting because I'm not showing you on the screen at the moment, but the word cloud that describes episodic social cognition tends to also emphasize the word person. So there's some mapping in the content of what people think about, in the sense that they describe thinking about people and show higher neural responses to stimuli related to people. And so that's interesting. And one of the things we began to wonder about was how to understand the dynamic shifting that people that this dimension of experience seems to imply. So if you remember, it's a dimension that seems to be related to being focused on an external task versus instead engaging in some type of episodic stimulation. And that implies basically that we might be able to track the shifting that people do between these two states. And so one way that we can understand that is by using the task I'm showing you at the moment. So basically what we have is a very simple zero back task where basically people can, they basically wait until they see the blue target screen, and they have to make a very simple discrimination matching the shape in the center of the screen to the ones on either side. And we can compare that to a more complicated one back task in which they have to maintain in their working memory the location of shapes, because the probe in this particular condition will require them to remember what was on the screen prior to the probe screen. And the point of this, really, all that really matters at this point is that in one condition, you have to maintain task focus continually, and in the other one, your minds are freer to wander. So when we understand how people's answer questions as they spend longer amounts of time in each of these conditions, you can see that in the zero back task, people basically switch, as soon as they enter that block, they switch away from the task and begin thinking about episodic social information, whereas they tend to maintain better task focus in a more continual fashion in the one back task. And we also, in this experiment, had about 160 people, and we looked at the relationship between this difference in this dynamic shift from on task to episodic social information and its relationship to fluid intelligence. And what we identified was that people who have better fluid intelligence max out this difference the most. So what that means is that people who scored higher in Raven's progressive matrices tend to stay on task throughout the working memory task, but to shift away from that task when they enter the easier zero-back task. So this is interesting because it implies that there's a dynamic shifting between the task-focused state and the episodic social state that we can capture in the context of our condition. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to work out a way to characterize this dynamic shift as people perform the task. And in this particular data I'm going to talk about, we also recorded the brain. So that allowed us to see whether we could identify neural patterns that reflect this shift between the task focus and off-task state. And so basically the way to think about what we did is we set up a counter that basically tracked how long the person had been in each of the conditions. And we basically hypothesized that as you spend longer in the tasks, you will basically shift away from tasks towards internal thought patterns. And then what we could do is use the counter as a regressor against the neural data to identify the regions that tended to increase or decrease with the passage of time. And what I'm showing you at the moment are the regions that tended to decrease activity as time passed. And you can see that they're, broadly speaking, this captured regions of dorsal atrophy frontal cortex, parietal cortex, lots of regions that are often seen in complex tasks. So then what we could do was we wanted to try to understand whether this passage of time pattern seemed to reflect the shift from on-task to off-task thought. So I've already illustrated it in a prior slide that one way to think about the difference between the on and off-task states is to think about them as different ends of a connectivity gradient that should be identified through the application of diffusion embedding to the Human Connectome project data. And I'm just showing you this in the form of what they call rain cloud plots, that's what they're called, where you can basically see that the on-task state is more similar to one end of gradient 3 and the off-task state is more similar to the other end. And what we could do is we could take the map that we generated using the temporal analysis I just described and make the same comparison to the third gradient. And what you can see basically is that the regions that the map that we generated by looking at the passage of time is very similar to the off-task map and also similar to gradient 3. And so what that kind of means is that we can kind of think about the passage of time analysis as providing information about how people switch between the on-task and the off-task state. So I'm just showing you this in a 3D scatter plot where you can basically see that when you compare the different maps describing on or off task or increasing or decreasing passage of time, that they tend to cluster together such that they seem to be different they occupy different ends of the third gradient. And so what that kind of suggests is that this shifting between the on and the off task state emerges with the passage of time and is described by the shift from external task focus mode, where the default mode network is suppressed, to the opposite state where the default mode is more active and the task positive regions are reduced. So one question that therefore might emerge from this type of analysis is how it is that people tend to maintain focus in an appropriate manner. Because if you remember, the way we capture these experiences is we have these two conditions, one where it's basically easy to do and another where it's more difficult. And also intelligent people seem to be able to separate these conditions in terms of the thought patterns they have, so that they tend to maintain on-task thoughts in the more difficult task and switch away from the task when it becomes easier. And so we wanted to understand how it was that people maintain the appropriate pattern of thought across these conditions. So one way you can think about this is formalizing different relationships between the tasks that people are performing and the pattern of thought that they engage in. So at the moment, I'm just showing you data that we've already talked about in an earlier slide, which just shows that there's a region of dorsal parietal cortex, which is basically related to on task. But what I'm also highlighting is that this particular relationship didn't really vary across the task. So what that means is this region of parietal cortex just shows higher activity when people are in the on-task state, and it doesn't really care about whether they're in the easier or the harder task. But if you formalize a different contrast, which is looking for a relationship such that are there any brain regions which are more active when people are off task in the easy condition and on task in the harder condition. What we found was there was a region of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that seems to have this property. And this is quite an interesting distinction because in contrast to the parietal region, which seemed to only be related to whether people were externally focused or not, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex seems to be important for understanding whether or not people are mapping the relationship between the tasks they're performing and the type of cognition that would be appropriate under those circumstances. So it implies that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is really abstractly reflecting some type of abstract relationship between the appropriateness of the task of that's really mapping the relationship between the task you're performing and whether or not it allows you to engage in particular types of thought. So to sum up this part of my talk, we have identified using experience sampling this pattern of thought that seems to vary between a task-focused state and a state where people are engaged in social episodic thought. This seems to be anchored by regions in parietal cortex in terms of the task focus aspect of this experience. And the ventral medial prefrontal cortex seems to be an important region for generating episodic social cognition. It looks like this is related to the task negative mode that the default mode network can have. And it seems to be that this is the regulation of this type of thought in the sense that how we match the pattern of thought we're having to the external environment seems to be done by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, so half an hour in. Okay, right. So this is the second dimension that I'm going to talk about today. This one is interesting because it seems to be related to having particularly detailed types of thought. So I'm again showing you the word clouds that we generated across these three different task environments. And one thing that's important to note is this seems to be slightly different to the prior pattern of thought because, first of all, it doesn't seem to have two ends to it. So we know that's true because the words are all red, which means they all have the same loading. And it also doesn't seem to dissociate content the way the last one did. So if you remember from the last slide, that seemed to dissociate between having an external focus on a task that you're performing and having an internally generated mode at the other end. This seems to just vary between having thoughts that vary in the amount of detail that they have. So one way to think about this is it might be telling us something about a feature of the form that experiences can have rather than specifically relating to its content. So one of the earliest indications that we had about the neural basis behind this pattern of thought came from a study we performed and published in PNAS in 2018. And what we did in this experiment was we looked at, we used representational similarity to check the relationship between different regions of the brain and their similarity to the variation in the patterns of thought that I just described. And what we found was that the more detailed thoughts were in the harder one-back condition of the task that I've already talked about, seem to be associated with patterns of neural activity that you could identify in different parts of the brain, but in particular within the default mode network. And it was interesting to make this observation for various reasons. First of all, the pattern of thought that seems to be related to the default mode network doesn't really fit some of the features that we might have expected it to have. So for example, it doesn't seem to be massively related to, it's not the strongest form of off-task thought that we can see within our data set, because that's the other pattern I've already described. But the other thing that's interesting about our observation was that it was actually happening in the more difficult one-back condition of our experiment. And so this seemed to be important because it wasn't really a kind of canonical default mode network pattern of thought when we made this observation. So to understand it in greater detail, we performed a more normal analysis where we just looked at the univariate relationship between neural activity and the answers that people gave on the task. And what we found again is that this form of detailed thought seemed to be localized to the posterior cingulate cortex. So we now know that it seems to be being driven by posterior parts of the default mode network rather than, for example, the medial prefrontal cortex. And one question that we then also wanted to understand was whether or not this relationship kind of generalized to different situations. So we already had a big set of people who had performed this experiment in the laboratory, in the behavioral lab, sorry. And what we did was we brought them back in, and they just basically performed a self-reference experiment in the scanner, where we asked people to tell us whether specific words applied to them. We wanted to use self-reference because it felt like that was a very different situation to a one-back experiment that I've just described, in the sense that, you know, this is a condition where, for example, we might expect the default mode to be active, and in fact it was. But what we found even in this circumstance was, if we try to understand patterns of neural activity and their relationship to individual differences in these dimensions of thought, that what we found was that the people who had the most detailed thought during the sustained attention experiment in the lab also tended to recruit the posterior cingulate more in the self-reference condition. And this is kind of interesting and important because it speaks to the general role that this phenomenon seems to have, in the sense that it generalizes across quite different contexts. And in a paper that is purely behavioral, we wanted to understand this relationship in greater detail. So this paper has just been accepted in Conscious Cognition and should hopefully be out quite soon. And what we did in this study was we just had a large number of different tasks: working memory, gambling, switching, and so forth. So I think participants did 12 in a 2-day experiment. We mapped their thoughts using multiple dimensional experience sampling. And we just really wanted to understand where this type of thought was most prevalent. And what you can see actually is that this type of thought seems to be really strongly prevalent in tasks that are difficult or demand attention, like working memory, gambling, or switching. And not particularly important when people are engaged in more passive tasks like audiobooks or Inscapes, which is basically a bit like a screensaver. And so it seems to be that this pattern of thought that we believe is related to the default mode, in particular the posterior aspect of it, is particularly important when tasks are difficult. So to sum up this part of my talk, our studies seem to suggest that there's an aspect of experience which is anchored by the posterior cingulate cortex. It seems to be involved in detailed experiences. It's important because it seems to have an external focus, in the sense that it occurs most commonly in tasks that are hard to perform, although we also see it in other externally focused tasks like self-reference. It's kind of interesting because this implies, therefore, that there is an external mode that the default mode network can have that is important for quite basic task processes, probably, because the working memory task that we use is really to do with remembering the location of the spatial location of shapes like squares and circles. So it's not really autobiographical, for example, in the type of content it's involved in. So I just want to close my talk today by talking about the implications of these results for how we can think about neural functioning and how different neural systems contribute to thought. So I think it should be clear from my talk that the notion of brain regions as serving task negative or task positive functions is probably an insufficient ontology from which to infer the relationship between neural function and cognition. Both the key observations from my talk, really, the relationship between the posterior cingulate cortex and detailed thought, and the relationship between the DLPFC and the regulation of thought in line with demands, illustrate this, because on the one hand, the posterior cingulate cortex seems to be important for an external mode of cognition rather than an internal mode, and generally speaking, the default mode network is often assumed to be an internal system, and our data suggests that's probably an incomplete account of what it does. Whereas the DLPFC is often thought to be an important for a task positive mode of operating, whereas we find that it plays a more general role, so that it's not so much to do with a task positive mode, it seems to be to do with regulating thought that can also be off task if that type of thought is occurring in a context in which the environment lacks compelling demands, and so the person probably is better spending their time engaging in off task thought. So what this really implies, I believe, is that we need to have a broader understanding. We need to take the question about how neural systems relate to cognition and adapt a more broad perspective. It seems to be that, in particular, the mapping of neural function to cognitive states requires that we have a broad range of contexts in which this observation is made, because if we don't do that, we might confound states in which we might confound a broader role of cognition with a specific one we might basically confound a state where, for example, the DLPFC is playing a role which seems to extend beyond a specific context. And we might equate that instead with one where it seems to have a more directed role in cognition. Okay, and so at that point, I'd just like to thank everybody for listening and remind you that all of the work was really done by other people than me. Okay, thanks for listening.
Great, thanks so much, Johnny. That was an excellent talk. Do we have any questions? Yes, Malar can be first.
Thank you. What a wonderful talk, really fascinating work. I guess my questions, I suspect you thought of this, but I was wondering, have you imagined or thought of a framework in which you can use this approach, kind of overarching the multidimensional experience sampling in clinical populations, for example? I mean, that to me is kind of a place where where you can kind of get a bit more of the spectrum to, I guess, to organize and to look at. So have you given any thought or have any other data related to that?
It's a really good question, actually. I mean, it's definitely one of the next steps in the research program, I think, which is that at the moment, I think what we really needed to do was a lot of the work I've talked about today, I think, is really is kind of like basic groundwork that allows you to begin to ask these types of questions. So for example, like I didn't really talk about it, but if you want to relate ongoing experience to the brain, the way that I did in my experiments, when you apply principal components analysis to it, it massively simplifies the problem, because before, when people did experiments like this, what you would do is you would have like an on and an off task bin, basically, which meant that you'd have to hope that participants had the same number of off-task and on-task thoughts. Otherwise, your data samples were basically they weren't matched together properly. Whereas when you apply PCA in the way that we do, you just log every experience sampling probe with a score somewhere along the dimension, which just makes the problem very tractable. And so now that we know basically how to do these sorts of experiments, the next step is definitely to do the kind of thing that your question refers to. We should be able to map these dimensions in psychiatric populations, probably in the real world, and hopefully relate these back to neural information. And I think one of the things that we might be able to do by doing this is shed some light on the underlying neural systems and how they relate to different clinical conditions. Because one of the things that seems to be emerging from resting state studies linked to psychiatric investigations is that quite a lot of the networks I've highlighted in my talk today, so for example, the DLPFC is within the ventral attention network or the saliency network, and obviously the default mode network and the dorsal attention network, they all seem to be networks that are important in psychiatric conditions. However, they also seem to be important across a wide range of different conditions. And one of the things that I think might happen if you began to combine the work that I'm doing with the sort of resting state within different psychiatric populations, we might be able to identify that the specific role that the networks play in the types of thoughts across those conditions will become a tractable problem. So for example, you might imagine that some aspects of the default mode network might serve future-related thoughts in anxious people and past-related thoughts in depressed people, or that type of thing. And so it might be that we can actually sort of gain traction on the relationship between the observed neural dysfunction and the psychiatric symptoms, I think.
So I guess I just have a follow-up as well. I'm assuming, or I'm imagining that a lot of this is in kind of young, healthy volunteers, or was there? You may have talked about the samples you used in terms, or the individuals who made up the populations you tested. It's probably a better way to express that question. Were they all young and healthy, like university age students, or were they from the general population?
So basically, the bulk of the participants were young, healthy students. However, we also, I didn't talk about the data today, but we also looked at older people, for example, as well. And we have some data that we've looked at in the lab and also in the real world, where we can look and see how these dimensions vary across the lifespan. One of the things that our experiments in that area suggest are that there are patterns of thought that primarily occur in older participants. They seem to be describing situations. They don't seem to engage in as much future focused thinking as younger people do, and instead seem to be reporting, particularly in the real, when we sample them in daily life, patterns of thought which seem to indicate like pleasant engagement, which we think is probably because when I say older people, they're all over 65. So we think that perhaps one of the reasons why we find these differences in the thought patterns is because older people are spending more of their time engaged in thoughts that are, engaged in activities that they enjoy, basically. So we have kind of looked across that. I mean, another thing that we haven't done yet, but would be interesting, would be to sample adolescents, because I also think that that might be an important sort of transition moment as people shift from, as they approach adulthood.
Yeah, I agree. I have so many other questions, but I'll let others ask. Thanks so much, Johnny. That was great work. Really exciting stuff.
Do we have any other questions? There's none coming up in the chat at the moment. I might ask one while we're waiting. So I guess I was really interested in the relationship with the fluid intelligence and how people with higher levels of intelligence are able to like modulate their patterns of thought, I guess, depending on the task demands. Is that something that you also see in daily life as well? Have you done any experience sampling that shows that perhaps people with higher levels of intelligence, you know, maybe in really important tasks in their day-to-day life, they're really engaged, whereas they kind of use the downtime more effectively in kind of an adaptive way?
I think some of the daily life sampling, we have looked at that, and I think, half of the relationship definitely was there. So I think what we found was that it's a little bit difficult to know precisely what tasks people are performing in the real world. You don't have as much control over, you know, their cognition as you do in the lab. But basically in daily life, what we find is that when people describe the situation as requiring more concentration, then the better they score in fluid intelligence, the more they remain on task, basically.
Yep.
So, it does seem to generalize. We found that this type of relationship, like I'm showing on the screen, the reality of the situation is that at the beginning, people tended to only do these experiments in quite demanding situations. So there was a lot studied use, for example, a no-go task, which is basically quite attentionally demanding. And generally speaking, under those circumstances, what you will find is a negative correlation between off-task thinking and working memory. But what we have identified across multiple studies is that when you kind of go to a very simple task like our zero-back task, then you either find that the relationship doesn't hold, so there would be no correlation, or you find that it reverses like it did in this one, implying that basically things like executive control are playing a really abstract role in how people organize their thoughts. So they're not really about focusing on the task, because a big part of our lives are probably devoted to thinking about what we are going to do. That's also important.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I think Sophie has a question. I'm not sure if they want to ask it out loud. Yeah.
Why not? Happy to. Hi, Johnny. A super nice talk. I have a question anyway, my question is about, like, a lot of your work is focused on the cortex, but don't you think that this is just putting like a shadow of like things that are happening beneath, like in like subcortical structures, or like cerebellum or brainstem or locus coeruleus? So to what extent are the patterns that you project on the cortex only cortical and not mirror images of something deeper?
I think that's a really good question. I guess the answer is that I don't know how it would relate, but I'm fairly sure it must relate, in the sense that I think that quite a lot of you know, the work that like McShine does, for example, where he looks at like the role of the thalamus in shifting patterns, because particularly, for example, in the slide I'm showing at the moment, in order to shift from the on-task to off-task state, the cortex obviously has to reorganize itself. And I think that that's kind of what our data is suggesting must happen. And therefore, one can imagine that quite a lot of the subcortical structures may be playing a key role in helping the cortex reorganize itself. And I guess probably that might include structures like the thalamus probably, and maybe even the striatum too, because the one end of the dimension seems to be anchored by the medial prefrontal cortex, which I believe is quite closely aligned to some activity in the striatum probably. But I'm fairly sure, I mean, there's also all the work that you obviously know about where you can map like the gradient patterns within the structure of the subcortex anyway. So my guess is probably you're completely correct that what is actually happening is that if we could map neural function in the subcortex, you would just see that they are mirroring each other, and that probably the causal role is more likely to be played by subcortical structures, I think, than the cortex itself.
Yeah, exciting. I think it's super intriguing work, and yeah, thank you for the cool talk.
No problem. Yeah.
Okay, if we don't have any other questions from anyone else, then we can go back to you, Millar, if you've still got some burning ones.
Yeah, I have one more maybe, and Sophie got to it. It's very much in line with the conversation we had earlier today. But you know, how would you imagine? And this isn't one. Maybe this is maybe a more general question. When you take at these kind of more gradient-based approaches, how do you imagine incorporating? I mean, because you spoke a bit about looking at the gradient within a structure, but how do you imagine integrating those subcortical regions, which certainly, you know, are subcortical or even hippocampal regions that are certainly integrated in how people regulate thought patterns or functions into this framework, because it is, I mean, I do imagine it to be quite important, kind of just as a follow-up.
I mean, I guess, one of the first kind of data I showed here, it was interesting. So this is this whole brain search, basically using a lot of expertise from Boris's lab to help us perform the analysis. And what was interesting, these are the only regions that the whole brain search found. And you can see that basically there's some type of like anterior to posterior difference, such that the posterior part of the parahippocampus seems to be involved in one type and the anterior is involved in the other type. And quite recently, Boris performed a very much more complex, and I think Casey Pakwala was the first author of the paper, but what happened in that paper was we looked just in the medial temporal lobe, identified a gradient pattern there. And what was really fascinating was that gradient pattern itself was mirroring the difference between two connectivity gradients across the cortex as a whole. And so there's some sort of relationship, therefore, between these two types of things, because, for example, one of the gradients that the hippocampal gradient seemed to be related to was the same connectivity gradient that we see the deliberate versus the on-task versus social cognition component of thought relating to. So that kind of tells us that difference in on versus external internal mode of cognition might be being mirrored by changes within the hippocampus. And so you can kind of imagine, I think, building on what Sophie's question implies, is that the puzzle that this type of research, I think, encourages us to focus on is that instead of thinking about brain regions as involved in processes, we also have to understand that the brain itself has to move through different states. I mean, that's kind of implicit in the concept of mind wandering, for example, that basically, you know, we start off by reading a book, and then at some later moment in time, we're thinking about something else. So it's an inherently dynamic problem. And I think that the subcortical systems seem to play a much bigger role than cortical regions do when you think about how they are pulling the cortex into different states. So I guess that the role that these other systems could play would be in helping reconfigure the brain. I mean, just thinking about it a different way around, the regions like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the PCC, they seem to be clearly participating in a whole range of different modes of operation. And once that's recognized, the next question that you have to understand is how does that get coordinated? Because they can't, I mean, they must be playing some role in the coordination themselves, but they could also be being driven by, you know, the release of dopamine or other neurotransmitters, or perhaps, you know, like the way that people think about the hippocampus, for example, is creating patterns when we recollect. So I'm not sure if I actually answered the question.
I think it's a tough problem, right? I think it's something, you know, especially in this literature or in functional connectivity literature in general, it's something we grapple with, right? There's no clean way in which to do it, right? I think, yeah, I mean, I haven't necessarily seen a good method for pulling it all together, unless you specifically ask the question about like striatum to cortex, right? And then I can kind of go into that system as if it's somehow divorced from all the other kind of, from the hippocampus, from the thalamus, whatever, which it's not, right? Yeah. But it does seem to be like I'm not saying this of you, I'm saying this of a lot of stuff we do as well, like a convenient kind of oversight to kind of skip over that because of the technical hurdles of trying to figure out, you know, how to integrate that properly within a whole brain analysis at these kind of more multidimensional levels, I think. But I think Sophie's got a question though.
Yeah, but I was now, sorry, reflecting on my question. I'm not sure if it's that smart, but like you focus a lot on behavior, right? And when connecting it to the brain, but isn't it a challenge then also that what you're measuring in the behavioral domain is just the tip of the iceberg? So that you have like a lot of brain beneath the behaviors that you're measuring, that you also like, that it's hard to match both of them, not to go to conscious and subconscious at some level, but so you see also why I regret the question a little bit, but maybe you can comment on what your thoughts about like probing thoughts to understand the brain, because yeah, maybe that is like my question. Like imagine, like to me, you seem to want to understand like thinking and then related to the brain, but isn't there also like a part that you cannot probe about thinking that is happening, that is still happening in the brain? So like maybe subconscious, if you wanna.
I mean, possibly. I mean, I guess I think there's two parts to your question. So one part I think is, I mean, so the maps that we show are basically like, they are an interaction term really, because you have like, you know, in this, for example, the parietal cortex thing, that comes out of a model where, you know, you have two tasks where you've recorded the brain. So the brain activity is, you can sort of reconstruct how the tasks change the brain. And then on top of that, you look at the relationship to what people said they thought at different moments in the task, right? So already, I think that's part of your question, because, you know, the bits that we're seeing at the moment are often like, they're quite often actually related to the patterns the tasks induce. So for example, the parietal cortex region is more active in the working memory task than in the zero back task. So it's been driven by the task people perform. And in addition to that, that parietal cortex region is showing the most activity in both tasks when people say they're on task. But I think the other part of your question, you can kind of see how you can begin to ask questions. So for example, in this analysis, where what we did was we obviously use subjective reports to generate the maps related to whether people are on or off task, right? So that's just really straightforward. That's like basically people telling us what they think about and how we relate that to the brain. But then we can do more sophisticated things like tracking the passage of time. And then because the map of increasing time resembles the map about being off task, we can then gain insight, I think, into how people transition from on to the off task state, basically. So I guess probably one way to think about this might be that by combining the neural activity with the experience sampling, you can probe at some of the mechanisms that underpin the thoughts that people have. That they probably, they probably are able to report the outcome of the process, I think, but they can't tell you how the process works. But the brain imaging can help us in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I will think a bit about it.
Awesome.
Okay, I think we probably have time just for one last question. Natasha?
Hi, I don't know if I'm on now because I can't see myself. That was a great talk. Thanks for giving it. I have a question. I think it's related to the one that was just asked. So when you're looking at the neural correlates of your task, you're looking at like regions that are along one dimension, right? Areas that are directly correlated to performance. I'm wondering if, to address the question asked just before, whether it would make sense to, after you account for direct correlations with task performance, are there additional indirect associations with those regions? So that kind of would get to answering the question about not only are there areas that directly map onto task, but there might be regions of the brain that indirectly map onto task, but do directly map onto the parietal cortex. Do I make sense? Are you following what I'm saying?
Could you go over it one more time?
Yeah, so, okay, so parietal cortex is directly mapping onto task.
Yep, okay.
Right? What other regions are associated with parietal cortex, but not with task necessarily? So it gets to the question of what are the regions that are more like maybe unconsciously or, you know, secondary to the task demands.
Okay, yes. I mean,
Whereas
I think
like what you're looking at are the regions that are directly related to task demands.
totally. So I guess one way to, so for example, I think that, I think if I understand your question, then what you're really asking is, you know, what's the, are there, so these two brain images that I'm showing, I think they might relate a little bit to what you're describing, because the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if you just looked at its highest levels of activity, it will always have higher activity in the one back task than zero back task, right? Okay, whereas the and also the parietal cortex will have the same pattern, okay? But what's interesting about it is that so basically people stay on task the most in the one back condition. So the IPS's behavior is kind of like follows the push of the task. So the task drives that region to go up. And that's probably corresponds to where people do that type of experience that it's linked to the most. But the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is doing something that's different to that, because its activity isn't higher in the zero back condition, but it's doing a completely different type of operation, or it's influencing cognition to go in a completely different type of direction. So that tells us that there might be a difference between some regions. There might be some conditions, for example, where the brain activity isn't high because of the task, but is still influencing cognition in an important way. So like the DLPFC evidence might be an example of that, because it isn't really, it seems to be doing important things to cognition. It's just not being, but it's doing that in a situation where it's not showing the highest activity.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that might be a little bit.
Yeah, it's kind of what I'm getting at. What I'm saying is more that instead of directly mapping onto task, like what Sophie was saying, was perhaps there are other regions that are more subtly related to task performance, kind of like the dorsolateral, that aren't being detected because of, you know, the predominant signal being the task mapping.
Yes. Yep.
Right. So once you account for the predominant signal and you look at secondary signals that like maybe track IPS or track dorsolateral, you could identify networks that are like indirectly related to
task.
task.
I see. Okay. Yes. Right. I see.
That's what I'm asking. Yeah.
So I mean, it's a bit like looking at the connectivity of these regions.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just like a multi-dimensional approach to that question. So here's the task. Here are the regions that are directly mapping onto task. Here are the regions that kind of modulate that direct mapping. Indirect.
It's actually interesting, because in the paper where we identified these maps, we performed something called an echoes analysis in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we did this at rest, though, so it wasn't really when we were driving with the task.
Yeah.
And what we found was that DLPFC region basically contains, so the echoes analysis is just basically running a decomposition only within the region of interest. So we just basically run an ICA only in this map, the DLPFC region. And what was really interesting was it found it had a lot of different echoes of different networks from outside of it, but one of them was mapping the IPS region. And one of them was mapping the lateral default mode network. And basically, we could predict the amount of time that people spent off task in the zero back condition in the lab based on the strength of the coupling between those two echoes. So that if within your DLPFC, the region that maps the IPS is quite uncorrelated with the region that maps lateral default mode network, then you're able to spend more time in the easy task being off task. So there definitely will be ways that you can take this approach and perform much more sophisticated understanding of how it is that the signals that we're picking up here are related to the rest of the brain and the operations that it's performing, for sure. There's no question.
That's great. Thanks.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for today, but thanks again, Johnny, for the really fascinating talk and great discussion.